What if I told you the most powerful man in Middle East peace wasn't American, wasn't Israeli, wasn't Arab, but a 37-year-old soldier from West Africa? No oil, no nuclear weapons, no permanent seat at the UN, just one voice, one continent, one chance. And somehow, he did what the world said was impossible. On May 15th, 2025, as missiles rained down on Gaza and air raid sirens howled over Tel Aviv, while Washington debated and Paris postponed, one man stepped in. Captain Ibrahim TRAORÉ, president of Burkina Faso, announced that Africa, yes, Africa, would broker peace between Israel and Palestine. Laughter followed. CNN called it symbolic. The Israeli press mocked it. The U.S. warned him to stay out. Even some African diplomats rolled their eyes. But 30 days later, Israeli and Palestinian leaders were shaking hands in Amman, Jordan, and the ceasefire. It is held for 4 straight months. 0 civilian deaths, aid flowing, hope returning. So now ask yourself, who do you trust to make peace? The men with missiles, or the man they tried to kill? Yes, just 5 days after the agreement, Traoré's convoy was ambushed in Tel Aviv. One of his aides was assassinated. He was shot. And still, he refused to stop. He stood before the world and said, "You can shoot me, but you will not shoot down peace." What kind of leader does that? What kind of world fears that? And what else have we been lied to about when a soldier from the Sahel succeeds where empires failed? If this is your first time hearing about Africa's rise as a diplomatic superpower, it won't be the last. Subscribe and hit that bell, because what happens next may redefine who leads the world and who really wants peace. The day Africa declared it would solve the Middle East, nobody expected it. Not the Arab League. Not the White House. Not even most African nations. But on May 15th, 2025, Captain Ibrahim TRAORÉ walked onto a modest podium in Ouagadougou and said the words that shook global diplomacy. Africa will end the war between Israel and Palestine. Reporters froze. Analysts scoffed. One Western diplomat was even caught on a hot mic saying, "Let him play hero. He'll be forgotten in a week." They were wrong. TRAORÉ wasn't posturing. He wasn't campaigning. He was deploying on a mission more dangerous than any battlefield, diplomacy without permission. His reasoning, simple, sharp, and impossible to ignore. For decades, the West has tried and failed, he said. Maybe it's time the world listened to the victims of history, not its authors. He called on the African Union to act as neutral moderator. He opened direct back channels with both Israeli and Palestinian officials. And most controversially, he invited Russia and China to co-guarantee the process, shutting out Western powers entirely. It was bold. Some said reckless. Others said genius. TRAORÉ understood one crucial fact no one else dared say aloud. Africa had nothing to lose. It wasn't selling weapons to Israel. It wasn't funding factions in Gaza. It had no colonial guilt, no historical entanglement. Africa could speak, not for profit, but from pain. Behind closed doors, something extraordinary began. For 14 days, TRAORÉ's small diplomatic team worked around the clock, engaging both sides through encrypted channels and trusted African intermediaries. He didn't promise political solutions. He promised something deeper, a ceasefire not built on fear, but on dignity. It worked. On May 29th, 2025, the world gasped again. Both Israel and the Palestinian Authority agreed to send delegations to Amman, Jordan, for preliminary talks, under one condition: the African Union would chair the process. No U.S. observers. No French advisors, no British press, just Africa in the room. The very idea stunned traditional power centers. Western media labeled it a symbolic PR stunt, but intelligence insiders whispered a different word: breakthrough, because they knew something others didn't. Both sides respected Traoré not for his military rank, but for his moral clarity. He had stared down jihadists in the Sahel. He had survived coups, sanctions, and assassination threats. And now he was offering something no Western power ever could: a chance to be heard without being judged, a chance to end the cycle, not by winning, but by healing. So ask yourself, if a young African soldier can bring enemies to the same table, what's stopping the so-called superpowers from doing the same? And more importantly, why did they try to stop him? Because what happened next would send shockwaves far beyond diplomacy, and blood would be spilled. Stay with us. They tried to kill the peacemaker. It only made him stronger. The first 3 days of talks in Amman were quiet. Too quiet. Palestinian officials sat with arms crossed. Israeli delegates stared at the floor. Western observers, nowhere to be seen. And yet, the room was filled with something rare in diplomacy: truth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't start with maps or borders. He started with silence. Then he spoke, not as a negotiator, but as a man who had buried too many children. I've watched a mother scream into the earth where her son used to play. I've seen a father go quiet when he sees a school bus because his daughter will never come home again. That's not Palestinian pain. That's not Israeli pain. That's human pain. And I know it, because I come from a land that bleeds too. He paused, then looked each delegate in the eye. Your children's blood is the same color as mine. The world has divided you with walls, but grief knows no checkpoints. On day 4, the atmosphere changed. Israeli and Palestinian representatives began to speak, not in demands, but in memories. By day 7, they listened. By day 10, they wept. And by day 15, they signed the Amman Accords. The terms were simple, but revolutionary: a 14-day ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank, humanitarian corridors protected by African peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges monitored by neutral African mediators, independent observers from China, Russia, and the African Union, no Western powers involved. It was the longest negotiated ceasefire in over a decade, and it hadn't come from New York, or Geneva, or Brussels. It had come from Ouagadougou. But peace is dangerous when it comes from the wrong direction. On June 25th, just 5 days after the accords were signed, Traoré's convoy was ambushed in Tel Aviv. Snipers, precision fire, military-grade optics. One bullet tore through the neck of Lieutenant Kabore, Traoré's closest aide. Another pierced Traoré's shoulder. The convoy was rerouted. Emergency surgery saved his life, but the message had already been sent. You weren't supposed to succeed. Forensics confirmed the worst fears. The weapon matched elite NATO stockpiles. The snipers used tactics aligned with Western special forces. And the ambush route. Only a few foreign intelligence units had access. Who pulled the trigger? No name was ever released. But everyone understood. Traoré emerged 3 days later, arm in sling, voice shaking but unbroken. At a global press briefing, he didn't call for revenge. He didn't name suspects. He just said, "They killed my brother to silence peace. They failed, because now the world is listening." The backlash was immediate and unexpected. Israeli and Palestinian officials condemned the attack together. African Union nations rallied behind Traoré. Protests erupted in West Africa. Don't kill our voice. And in Europe, silence, except in one leaked cable from a European diplomat. If this continues, we lose control of the narrative. So ask yourself, who fears peace more? The ones holding the guns or the ones writing the headlines? Because in that moment, the world didn't just see a ceasefire. They saw the beginning of a new order. And someone wanted it stopped. The peace that exposed the power shift. The sniper's bullet didn't just wound Captain Traoré. It pierced the illusion that only the West could broker peace. Within 48 hours of the attack, shockwaves ripped through global politics. In Africa, the response was immediate and historic. More than 2.3 million people flooded the streets of Ouagadougou in what became the largest peace rally in African history. They carried not just Burkina Faso's flag, but also the flags of Israel and Palestine. Children held signs, "Africa can speak for peace." Elders chanted, "Don't silence our son." Across 34 African nations, governments issued formal statements of solidarity. State broadcasters replaced regular programming with coverage of the peace talks. Burkina Faso declared a national week of mourning for Lieutenant Kabore. But in the West, silence echoed louder than gunfire. While international media briefly reported on the ceasefire, they quickly shifted focus. Outlets emphasized fragile progress, questionable mediation, and lack of experience. Some pundits questioned whether an African military leader could truly be neutral. Others speculated Traoré's ties to China and Russia made him a geopolitical risk. Behind the scenes, it was worse. Leaked intelligence confirmed a surge in Western diplomatic pressure against countries that openly supported the Amman Accords. France threatened to cut aid to former colonies. The U.S. delayed a scheduled African Union trade summit. British intelligence quietly circulated reports warning of African overreach. And yet, the ground had already shifted. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting to world events, it was shaping them. In Gaza, aid flowed uninterrupted. In Tel Aviv, newspapers ran front-page headlines, "Who is Captain Traoré?" In refugee camps, parents spoke of hope, not for escape, but for return. Even within Israel and Palestine, a strange unity emerged, not in politics, but in emotion. They had finally met a mediator who understood suffering instead of exploiting it. And for African citizens, the shift was seismic. They saw a leader who didn't beg for approval. He didn't ask for permission. He acted, and the world followed. So now the question whispered from Accra to Algiers was no longer, "Can Africa lead?" It was, "What happens when we do?" Universities launched programs on African diplomatic strategy. Social media overflowed with the phrase, "Africa the peacemaker." Youth movements surged, echoing a simple demand, "Let us lead." But not everyone welcomed that momentum. In boardrooms in Brussels, think tanks in Washington, and embassies in Paris, new strategies were being drafted, not for peace, but for containment. Because the unspoken fear had become visible, if Africa could end the war in the Middle East, what else could it solve without permission? And what happens when the once colonized start rewriting the rules? Because peace wasn't the only thing born in Amman. A new global balance was forming, and the world wasn't ready for it. The West watched. The East moved. Africa led. While Africa celebrated and the Middle East exhaled, another theater was unfolding, quietly, nervously, in the corridors of global power. In Washington, the success of the Amman Accords triggered what one think tank insider called a diplomatic red alert. The National Security Council convened an emergency session, not about war, but about African diplomacy. Reports flowed in from embassies across Africa, young protesters waving signs, "No more Western peace." Local leaders using terms like sovereign solutions and post-colonial mediation for a U.S. Foreign policy built on strategic leverage and controlled narratives. This was unfamiliar territory. At the State Department, one question surfaced repeatedly. If we're not at the table, are we still in the game? France faced its own crisis of relevance. The Élysée Palace was flooded with criticism from former African colonies, accusing Paris of undermining Traoré's mission. French intelligence denied involvement in the assassination attempt, but few in West Africa believed it. The UK, meanwhile, issued a cautious statement supporting any initiative that promotes stability, a vague diplomatic shrug, but leaked parliamentary memos revealed deep unease. Africa is no longer just a development issue, it's a power player. Germany, often the silent giant, reacted differently. The Bundestag approved $100 million for a new African diplomatic exchange fund. Behind closed doors, Berlin understood what others feared to admit. The Global South had entered the arena, and it came with receipts. While the West analyzed, the East moved. Russia immediately offered enhanced security cooperation for African diplomats. President Putin praised Traoré's moral courage in the face of sabotage. China pledged $500 million in infrastructure for African-led peace institutions. Foreign Minister Wang Yi declared, Africa is no longer a passive continent. It is a partner in global governance. Iran and Turkey echoed the sentiment. Tehran hosted African religious leaders to discuss faith-based diplomacy. Ankara offered to co-host the next round of African-mediated talks. The shift was unmistakable. Where the West saw threat, the East saw opportunity. And caught between these tectonic movements, Africa stood, not as pawn, but as player. For decades, the world treated Africa as a place to send aid, build bases, or extract resources. Now, it was the source of solutions. The moral clarity Traoré displayed in Aman wasn't just personal, it was cultural. He hadn't offered neutrality out of convenience, but out of conviction. He wasn't non-aligned, he was post-aligned, and that terrified traditional powers who relied on predictability, hierarchy, and controlled chaos. Because now the unthinkable was possible, a future where Africa sets the diplomatic agenda. A world where African frameworks are taught at Harvard and used at the UN. A time when Ouagadougou holds more weight than Brussels. So ask yourself, if power can shift this fast, why were we ever told it couldn't? Because what Traoré ignited wasn't just peace in the Middle East. It was a spark on the global chessboard. And now, every piece is moving. The soldier who changed the game, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, is not just a name, he's a turning point. At 37, he became the first African leader to bring Israel and Palestine to the same table and keep them there. He did it without a superpower behind him. He did it without billion-dollar aid packages. He did it while bleeding, under sniper fire. And still, he succeeded. For decades, Africa was told to stay silent, to listen, to wait. But Traoré didn't wait. He acted. And in doing so, he didn't just broker a ceasefire, he exposed a truth long buried beneath treaties and tanks. Sometimes the most qualified to make peace are the ones who've been denied it the longest. Now the question is no longer, can Africa lead? The question is, what happens when it does? What happens when the world's most ignored continent becomes its moral compass? What happens when Western powers must respond, not to rebellion, but to reason? What happens when a man who buries his own soldiers preaches peace louder than presidents? And what happens when that voice can't be silenced? Because, make no mistake, someone tried. They put a bullet through the heart of this movement. But the echo, it's still ringing. 4 months of peace, 0 civilian deaths. Global eyes now turning south, not to save, but to learn. So ask yourself, if Africa can bring peace to the Middle East, what else have we been told it cannot do? And if the West fears that question, maybe it's because they already know the answer. If you believe the world must listen when Africa speaks, subscribe, share, comment. If you believe peace should not be punished, say his name. If you believe the future belongs to leaders who suffer with their people, then write it below. Africa the Peacemaker. Because history may not be written by the victors anymore. It may be written by the survivors. But history is never just about victories. It's about what comes after. And after Amman, the world didn't just witness peace. It witnessed fear. Fear in Washington that Africa had rewritten the playbook. Fear in Paris that the old colonial grip had slipped forever. Fear in Tel Aviv and Gaza that someone outside their war could end it without asking permission. And so the knives came out. Intelligence reports leaked of covert meetings where Western officials spoke bluntly. We cannot allow a precedent where Africa sets the terms of global diplomacy. The words weren't official policy, but they were a confession. The threat wasn't Traoré the man. It was Traoré the idea. Because if Africa could deliver peace in the Middle East, what stopped it from mediating in Ukraine or Taiwan or any of the world's blood-soaked flashpoints that superpowers had failed to resolve? That was the true danger, not to the balance of war, but to the balance of power. And yet, in the streets of Bamako, Dakar, Lagos, and Nairobi, the question wasn't about geopolitics. It was about pride. People lit candles, not just for Lieutenant Kabore, but for something larger, the birth of a new possibility. Africa is not just a place to be helped, one mourner said.